I stood up from the chair my mother-in-law had assigned me, the one at the far end of the table near the kitchen door where the waitstaff kept brushing past my shoulder, and I felt the panic in the room before I even opened my mouth. To understand how a quiet woman in a clearance rack blouse ended a 40-year-old fortune in under 9 minutes, you have to go back 6 months earlier, to a Tuesday in February when my husband forgot to close his laptop. I had been married to him for 11 years by then. 11 years of being told my sweaters made me look like a substitute teacher, 11 years of being introduced at parties as, and this is the wife, like I was a piece of furniture his family had reluctantly inherited. We lived in a renovated colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of house his mother had picked out and his father had paid the down payment on, and every room in it felt like something staged for a magazine I would never be on the cover of. His name doesn't matter for the purposes of this story. I'll just call him my husband, because by the end of it that's all he was. A title he lost the rights to. My mother-in-law ran a private foundation in the city. Old money, the kind that has been old for so long they've forgotten where it came from, though the family will tell you, unprompted, that it came from shipping and railroads and a great-great-grandfather who knew Andrew Carnegie. My father-in-law was on the board of 3 banks. The sisters, both younger than my husband, had married into families with last names you'd recognize from the side of a hospital wing in Manhattan. And then there was me. I came from Akron, Ohio. My father worked 31 years for Goodyear before his back gave out. My mother was a high school chemistry teacher who once corrected a textbook publisher on a polymer chain and got a small revision credit she kept framed in our hallway. I went to Carnegie Mellon on a full scholarship, then to MIT for my doctorate. I had been a quiet kid, the kind who reads in cars and at the dinner table and during her own birthday parties. And I became a quiet adult, the kind who could sit through an entire dinner without saying a word and not miss anything anyone said. I met my husband at a charity gala in Boston, 10 months after I'd been awarded a patent on a class of catalysts that, depending on how you measure it, has applications in everything from battery manufacturing to water purification. I didn't tell him about the patent. I told him I worked in chemistry. He told me he worked in capital allocation, which I would later learn meant he sat in an office on the 38th floor of a building his father owned and made phone calls his father had already approved. The first year was good. I'll give him that. The first year, he looked at me like I was something he'd discovered, and his family was polite to my face because that's what people of their breeding do, smile coldly at the woman their son drags home from a charity event in a dress she bought off the clearance rack at a Nordstrom outlet. By year 2, my mother-in-law was leaving brochures for personal stylists on the kitchen counter. By year 3, my husband had started calling me Doc in front of his friends, in a tone that made the word smaller every time he said it. I kept working. That was the thing they never understood. I kept working through all of it. I had 2 more patents by year 5, a third by year 7, and by year 9 I had quietly co-founded a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts with 2 of my former graduate students. We licensed our catalyst technology to industrial buyers in Germany, South Korea, and Texas. I drove a 4-year-old Honda Pilot to meetings. I wore the same charcoal blazer for 6 years. The company grew slowly the way a thing grows when you don't have to perform its growth for anyone. My husband knew I had a job. He thought it paid me $60,000 a year and that I worked from the home office on the 3rd floor of our colonial. He never asked the name of the company. He never asked the names of my colleagues. Once, at a Christmas dinner at his parents' house in Westport, his younger sister asked me what I did, and before I could answer he laughed and said, "Honey, she does chemistry. It's like cooking but worse." Everyone at the table laughed. I laughed too. I was good at laughing by then. Now, that Tuesday in February, he had been working from home that morning, which he hated doing because it meant he had to share the wireless network with me and my school projects, as he called them. He came downstairs around 11, told me he was going to the gym, and left his laptop open on the kitchen island. I wasn't snooping, I want to be clear about that. I went into the kitchen to refill my coffee and I saw the screen, and the screen was open to his messages, and the messages were not from a man whose wife was supposed to walk by. The first one I saw said, "She has no idea." The second one said, "She still thinks the prenup is fair." The third one said, June 14th, her birthday. That's when I'll do it, in front of everyone. She'll be too humiliated to fight it. The fourth one was a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, blonde, mid-30s, posed in front of what looked like a beach house in Nantucket. The caption underneath said, Our house, my love, 7 more months. I stood there in my own kitchen and I read every message in that thread. Then I scrolled back. Then I scrolled back further. The affair had been going on for 14 months. The plan to leave me had been in motion for 9. My mother-in-law knew. My father-in-law knew. Both sisters knew. The woman, whose name turned out to be a real estate broker my husband had met at a charity tennis tournament, had already been measuring curtains in the Nantucket house, which, I learned from a forwarded email, my father-in-law had purchased in November as a kind of wedding gift in advance. The most expensive part of being underestimated is that people don't bother to lock their screens around you. I refilled my coffee, I closed the laptop, I went up to my 3rd-floor office and I sat down at my desk and I did not cry. I want to tell you I cried, because that's what a story like this is supposed to have, but I didn't. What I did was open a new document and start a list. The list had 3 columns. The first was titled Assets, the second was titled Exposures, the third was titled Timing. By that night I had filled in 2 pages. My husband had a lot of money on paper. What he didn't have was money he actually controlled. The colonial house was in his father's name, held in a trust. The cars were leased through his father's holding company. His personal brokerage account was small, around $300,000, and most of that was tied up in restricted stock from his cousin's startup, which I happened to know from a friend who worked at the SEC, was under preliminary review for a registration irregularity. His salary at his father's firm was a generous $500,000 a year, but his actual personal liquidity, the money he could put his hands on without his father signing something, was around $42,000 in a checking account at a regional bank in Greenwich. His parents had the real money. His parents had the foundation, the houses, the cars, the membership at the club in Palm Beach, the boats, the artwork, the wine cellar. His parents had bought the Nantucket house. His parents had paid for the woman's car, a white Range Rover I would later learn had been leased through the foundation as a consultant vehicle. The foundation, that was where I started. A private family foundation in the United States is a beautiful thing when it's clean. It allows wealthy families to give away money in their own name and receive a tax deduction for doing so. The rules around it, however, are strict. Self-dealing is prohibited. Compensation has to be reasonable and documented. Funds cannot be used to benefit family members directly. The IRS publishes a guidebook on this. It's about 150 pages. I read it that February twice, and I made notes in the margins. Then I started pulling threads. I'm not going to bore you with the technical details, because the technical details aren't the point. The point is that the foundation, which my mother-in-law had run for 26 years, had been used for at least the last decade as a personal slush fund. The Range Rover for the mistress was just the most recent example. There had been a beach rental in St. Bart's in 2019 categorized as a site visit for conservation grant evaluation. There had been $400,000 in 2021 paid to a consulting firm that, when I traced it through 3 layers of LLC, turned out to be owned by my husband's older cousin, who was using the money to finance a wine bar in Tribeca. There was a recurring monthly payment to my mother-in-law's personal hairstylist, classified as communications and public relations. I documented all of it. I screenshotted every record I could get into through the Foundation's online portal, to which I had access because I had once, 2 years earlier, agreed to serve as a non-voting advisor on a science education grant committee. My mother-in-law had given me that role to make me feel included, the way you might give a child a wooden spoon to stir an empty pot. She had never bothered to revoke my login. I worked on this every night for 6 weeks. I worked on it at my office in Cambridge when I went up there on Mondays. I worked on it on planes to client meetings in Dallas and Munich. I did not tell a single person. Not my mother, not my 2 business partners, not the attorney I retained in early March through a friend of a friend, a woman named, Well, let's just call her my attorney, a former federal prosecutor who now ran her own firm in Stamford and who, after our second meeting, told me, in the calmest voice I've ever heard a person use, "We're going to be very precise with this." By the end of March, we had 3 things. 1. A complete evidence-backed report on the Foundation's misuse of funds, sufficient to support an IRS Form 1399 referral and likely an investigation under intermediate sanctions rules. 2. A sealed letter from a forensic accountant detailing my husband's involvement in 2 of the schemes, including the wine bar and a property in Vermont. 3. A buyer. That was the part nobody could have predicted. The buyer. My father-in-law's firm, the one my husband worked at, had been quietly hemorrhaging clients for 2 years. They were what people in the industry call structurally illiquid. They had a lot of value on paper, in the form of long-term contracts and minority stakes in private companies, but they had been over-leveraging short-term debt to fund a Florida real estate venture that wasn't doing as well as my father-in-law had been telling everyone at the club. I knew this because the principal banker on that real estate venture was a man I had presented at a chemistry conference with 11 years earlier, before either of us had grown up, and he had told me about it one afternoon over coffee in Boston. Not knowing that the firm in question was my husband's family's firm, because I had introduced myself to him as just my own name, the way I always did at conferences. He had needed someone to take a position. He had needed it badly. I told my attorney about it in early April. By the end of April, through a Delaware-registered entity that had nothing to do with my own company and that listed no individual owner on its public filings, I had agreed in principle to acquire a substantial portion of my father-in-law's outstanding debt, at a discount that reflected the underlying risk. The closing was scheduled for June 11th, 3 days before my birthday. I want to pause here and say something, because some of you, hearing this, are going to think, you're as bad as they are. You're a vulture. You bought a man's debt to ruin him. And I want to say fairly that there is a version of this story where that critique lands. But this man, my father-in-law, had spent 11 years calling my mother the lady from Ohio at family events. He had once, at a Thanksgiving dinner, asked me to fetch coffee for his lawyer. "Since you're going to the kitchen anyway, dear." He had funded the affair that was scheduled to end my marriage on my own birthday. I did not buy his debt to hurt him. I bought his debt because it was for sale, at a price the market thought was fair, and because the person who was about to humiliate his daughter-in-law in public did not deserve the protection of being the only person at the table with leverage. 2 weeks before my birthday, I bought a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. I paid cash. I bought it under the same Delaware entity. I did not move into it. I just had it. I had the keys in a small envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk in Cambridge. I bought it because I knew that whatever I was about to do at that birthday dinner, I was not going home to the Colonial in Greenwich afterward. And I knew also that I needed a place that was mine, that no one in his family had ever seen, that was not connected to anything they could find. The week of my birthday, my mother-in-law called me. She called me twice, in fact, which was twice more than she had called me in any previous year of our marriage. The first call was to inform me, in the same tone she used to discuss the gardener, that they would be hosting a small dinner for me at the family's club in Greenwich on the evening of June 14th. 40 people. The private dining room. "We thought it would be a nice gesture," she said. "Your 40th is a milestone, even for someone in your situation." I said, "Thank you, that's so kind." The second call 3 days later was to ask me whether I planned to wear anything reasonable. I told her I had something in mind. What I had in mind was a navy dress my mother had helped me pick out at a Macy's outside of Akron. The kind of dress a woman might wear to a parent-teacher conference. I wore it on purpose. I want to be clear about that. I wore the dress they expected. I wore the small pearl earrings my husband had given me on our first anniversary, before he stopped pretending. I let my mother-in-law's friend Diane, who had cornered me in the parking lot, comment on the dress. I let my younger sister-in-law ask me with that little smile whether I had ever considered highlights just for fun. I sat at the chair near the kitchen door. I drank water. I waited. My husband stood up between the salad course and the entree. He had been drinking, but not enough to blame anything on it. He tapped his wine glass with a fork the way men do in movies. He cleared his throat. He smiled at the room. That smile he had, the one that had once made me think he was charming, and he said, "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight to celebrate my wife's birthday. 40 is a real milestone. For most people." 40 people laughed on cue. "You all know I love my wife very much," he continued, and the room got quieter because of course they knew. They had all known for 14 months, but sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes you marry someone with the best intentions, and you wake up one day and you realize the two of you are just on different paths. I looked at my plate. I let my hand shake a little around the stem of my water glass. I gave him exactly what he was expecting. "I'm not going to make a scene," he said, which is what men say right before they make a scene. "I just want everyone here, our families, our closest friends, to know that I've made a decision. I've spoken with my parents. I've spoken with my lawyer. As of tonight, I'm filing for divorce. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I really am, but you've held me back long enough." He smiled at me. He actually smiled. He held up his glass. He said, "Happy birthday, failure." The room did not laugh exactly. The room did the thing rooms do when something cruel happens, and everyone has decided in advance to pretend it's fine. There was a half laugh from his older sister. There was a long, slow exhale from his mother, like a woman setting down a heavy purse. There was a flash, just a flash, of teeth from his father, who was watching me to see if I would cry. I did not cry. I reached down to the floor where I'd set my handbag, an old leather thing my mother had given me when I started graduate school. I took out 3 envelopes. The first was thick and white. The second was thin and yellow. The third was black, the kind of envelope a wedding invitation might come in, the kind of envelope you'd notice if it was slid across a table toward you, slowly, in front of 40 people. I stood up. My chair scraped the floor. The kitchen door behind me swung once and a waiter froze halfway through it, balancing a tray of bread. "Before everyone leaves tonight," I said, and my voice did not shake, "I want to give a few gifts of my own." I walked the length of the table. The room was very quiet now. I stopped first behind my younger sister-in-law's chair. I set the white envelope on the table in front of her. "This is a copy of an IRS Form 13999, I said. "It was filed yesterday afternoon. It documents 26 counts of self-dealing and improper benefit at the foundation your mother chairs. The original is already with the agent assigned to the case. Your tuition is paid through the foundation. So is your sister's. So is the down payment on your townhouse. So is your husband's MBA. I would speak to a tax attorney before the end of the week." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her husband, a man whose family owned a chain of hotels in the Carolinas, set down his fork. I moved on. I stopped behind my mother-in-law. I set the thin yellow envelope on the table in front of her. "This is a copy of a property purchase agreement," I said, "for the house in Nantucket your husband bought in November. It's now in escrow. It was paid for using funds from a 2022 grant your foundation made to a sham 516-3 in Delaware. The 516-34 was incorporated by your husband's accountant. The IRS has the documentation. The State Attorney General's office in Massachusetts received a courtesy copy this morning. The house will not close to its intended occupant." My mother-in-law's hand was on her pearls. She looked for the first time in 11 years like a woman who had not been expecting something. I walked to the head of the table. My father-in-law was sitting very still. I did not give him an envelope. I gave him a piece of paper. "This is a notice of acceleration," I said. $41 million of your firm's short-term debt was acquired 3 days ago by an entity that filed a default notice this morning. The cross-default provisions on your Florida real estate venture were triggered at noon. Your line of credit at First Coastal was frozen at 1. By Monday morning, the firm will be in receivership. By Tuesday, your house in Westport will be subject to the lender's claim. By Wednesday, the cars in your driveway will not be yours." He looked at me, 40 years of money behind his eyes. He said very quietly, "Who are you?" "I'm the lady from Ohio," I said. I turned around. I walked back to my husband. He was still standing. He had not moved. I think he had stopped breathing somewhere around the IRS form. I held out the black envelope. He didn't take it. I set it down on his bread plate. "Happy anniversary," I said, "of the day you forgot to close your laptop." I picked up my handbag. I walked out of the private dining room. I walked through the main dining room, past 2 tables of club members who had stopped eating to watch. I walked through the lobby. I walked out into the parking lot where I had not parked the Honda Pilot because I had taken a car service. The driver was waiting. He opened the door. I got in. I did not look back at the building. I did not check my phone for an hour. By the time I did, I had 11 missed calls from my husband, 4 from my mother-in-law, 2 from my younger sister-in-law, and 1, surprisingly, from the blonde woman in the photograph, who had somehow gotten my number and who left a voicemail saying, in a voice that was small and tired, "I think you and I should talk." We did, 3 days later. She was not what I expected. She was a woman who had been told she was getting a beach house and a husband, and who, when the receivership notice hit the news, realized she had been getting neither. She had her own evidence. She had photos, texts, 2 voice memos from my husband in which he detailed in language a federal prosecutor would later describe as useful, exactly how he had moved certain funds through the foundation to underwrite the Nantucket purchase. She gave it to me on a flash drive in the kitchen of my brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, the second day I had ever set foot in the house I'd bought myself. I made her tea. She did not drink it. She left. The flash drive went to my attorney. The contents of the flash drive went to 3 different federal agencies. My husband was indicted in early September. His mother was indicted in November. His father, who had been the one I worried most about, slipped through criminal charges entirely on a technicality but lost the firm, both houses, the Palm Beach membership, the Nantucket place, and the boat. The cousin with the wine bar pleaded out. The younger sister-in-law, the one who had asked me about highlights, lost the townhouse in February of the following year. The other sister, who had always been quieter, called me once, asked if we could meet for coffee. I said no, politely. There are some bridges you don't need to keep standing just because you didn't burn them yourself. I sold the Colonial in Greenwich back to my father-in-law's trust through the receivership process at a price the court considered fair. I used the proceeds, along with a portion of the gain from the firm's debt, to fund a scholarship program at Carnegie Mellon for women in the physical sciences named after my mother. The first year we funded 16 scholarships, the second year 31, the third year 50. The students send me letters sometimes. I keep them in a drawer in the kitchen of the brownstone. The drawer is full now. I still drive the Honda Pilot. It has 137,000 miles on it. The dealership keeps trying to get me into something newer. I keep telling them I'll think about it. I won't. What did I learn from any of it? I'm not sure I'm supposed to have learned something. I'm not sure the lesson is what people want from a story like this. But if you're asking, I'll tell you what I tell the young women who write to me from the scholarship program when they ask me what I would have done differently. I would have closed the laptop sooner, I tell them. I would have stopped laughing at the joke earlier. I would not have spent 11 years convincing a man I was small enough to fit at the chair near the kitchen door. The thing about being underestimated is that it is, for a while, a kind of armor. It lets you move without being watched. It lets you move without being watched. It lets you think without being interrupted. It lets you build something without anyone asking what you're building. But armor is heavy. You can wear it for a long time before you notice. And when you finally take it off, the relief of it, the lightness, the way the room sounds when you finally stand up and let yourself be heard, that is a thing I would wish on every woman who has ever been told to fetch the coffee since she was going to the kitchen anyway. He sent me a letter from prison last spring. I didn't open it. I have a paper shredder now. It's the only luxury in 11 years I ever bought for myself. Happy birthday, I thought when I fed it through. Failure. I think about that night in Greenwich more than I should. Not the envelopes, not the way the room went quiet, not even the look on my father-in-law's face when he asked me who I was. I think about the 11 years before it. That's the part nobody asks about, and that's the part that matters. The thing nobody tells you about being underestimated is that it doesn't happen to you all at once. It happens in small concessions, a blouse you stop wearing because someone said something, a patent you stop mentioning at dinner because your husband once made a joke about it, a seat at the kitchen end of the table that you stop trying to move out of because moving out of it would mean being looked at, and being looked at after a while starts to feel more dangerous than being ignored. Every choice I made in those 11 years was a choice. That's the hardest thing I had to admit to myself after it was all over. Nobody forced me into that chair. Nobody held me down while my mother-in-law called my own mother, the lady from Ohio. I sat through it because I told myself sitting through it was kindness, or maturity, or strategy. It wasn't. It was fear dressed up as patience. What changed wasn't the laptop. The laptop was just the lid coming off a pot I had been boiling under for a decade. What changed was that I finally allowed myself to count what I already knew. I knew my husband was cruel. I knew his family was corrupt. I knew my work was real and theirs, in some quiet way that I had been afraid to say out loud, was not. The evidence had been on the kitchen island the entire time. I just had to stop looking past it. Cause and effect is not a religious idea. It's just arithmetic. My husband mocked the woman who held the patents his father's firm was secretly hoping to license. My mother-in-law used a charity as a personal checkbook for 26 years. My father-in-law leveraged a real estate venture he didn't understand against a banker who happened to know me by my own name. None of that was fate. They built the floor they fell through. I just stopped sweeping under it for them. If I could say one thing to the women who write to me from the scholarship now, the ones who are still sitting at the kitchen end of someone else's table, it would be this. Your decency is not the same thing as your silence. Your patience is not the same thing as your permission. You can be a good person and still refuse to fund the people who are spending your life. There is no medal for outlasting cruelty. There is only the cruelty and how much of yourself you let it keep. I built the brownstone. I built the scholarship. I built the woman who walked out of that dining room without looking back. None of it was revenge. All of it was arithmetic. And arithmetic, in the end, always closes the books.